Picture this. London in the year 1600. A single pound of nutmeg is worth more than a cow. A handful of black pepper could buy your way into nobility. These weren't just seasonings. They were symbols of wealth, status, and global power. They were kept in locked vaults, guarded as if they were gold. Spices weren't just culinary additions. They were currency, diplomacy, and warfare all in one. But how did mere spices, grown in jungles thousands of miles away, ignite wars, launch navies, reshape continents, and fund the rise of global empires? This is the incredible and often brutal story of how the spice trade turned the world upside down and laid the groundwork for the modern, globalized economy. As we unravel the saga, we'll journey from medieval markets to colonial conquests, from the blood-soaked Banda Islands to the marble halls of European parliaments. We'll trace the fragrant trails of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves across oceans and centuries, following the ambitions, betrayals, and bargains that made spices more valuable than silver. And most importantly, we'll see how a taste for flavor helped construct the very systems that govern our world today.
To understand the spice trade, you first need to understand why spices mattered so much. In medieval Europe, life was bland, monotonous, and often revolting. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. Spices like pepper and cloves masked rot, cinnamon enhanced wine, and nutmeg was believed to cure the plague. Doctors prescribed them, priests burned them in rituals, and nobles flaunted them on banquet tables. Spices were exotic, mysterious, and came from lands few Europeans could even imagine. Cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, pepper from the Malabar coast, saffron from North Africa. Their rarity made them more than just food. They were medicine, magic, and luxury combined. The rich demanded them, and where there's demand, there's opportunity. Moreover, spices fueled imagination and legend. Marco Polo wrote of lands where nutmeg trees grew wild and pepper forests blanketed the hills. Monasteries preserved ancient recipes that called for spices even they couldn't afford. A jar of saffron could pay a year's rent. These weren't just goods, they were objects of desire that connected Europe to mysterious, distant worlds. Spices symbolized the exotic unknown, and the journey to obtain them became almost spiritual. The sensory appeal of spices, their aroma, color, and flavor also played into their mystique. Spice blends became markers of regional identity and family heritage. Recipes were guarded like treasures, and cooks elevated to alchemists. In palaces and peasant kitchens alike, spices offered a taste of something greater: mystery, escape, power. For centuries, the Arab world controlled the flow of spices into Europe. Spices traveled through a long and dangerous land route from India through Persia, across the Arabian desert, and into ports like Cairo and Constantinople. From there, Venetian merchants handled distribution into Western Europe. This complex trade network allowed Arab traders to charge enormous markups. Venice became unimaginably rich, its wealth built on cloves and peppercorns. But that dominance caused resentment. European powers like Portugal, Spain, and later England looked at the high prices and thought, what if we could cut out the middlemen? What if we found our own way to the source? Arab traders also controlled the stories. They deliberately spread myths that cinnamon was fished from crocodile-infested lakes, or that cloves grew on dangerous volcano slopes to keep rivals at bay. These tales added to the mystique and inflated the value. But with new navigational tools and a hunger for profit, Europe was ready to challenge this monopoly head-on. And this wasn't just economic competition. The spice trade became a front in a larger religious and political struggle: Christendom versus Islam, West versus East. Crusades morphed into commercial campaigns, and caravans gave way to caravels. The quest for spices would redefine geography, religion, and warfare.
The Portuguese were the first to try. Backed by Prince Henry the Navigator, they began mapping Africa's west coast in the 15th century. After decades of exploration, Vasco da Gama finally reached India in 1498, establishing a sea route that bypassed Arab and Venetian control. Portugal quickly seized key ports: Goa in India, Malacca in Southeast Asia, Mozambique in Africa. They enforced a brutal naval regime, patrolling the Indian Ocean with heavily armed ships. The age of European naval empires had begun. Portuguese galleons didn't just bring spices home, they brought power and the right to dictate global trade. Their influence was immense. They imposed the cartaz system, a naval license forcing local merchants to trade under Portuguese oversight. Failure to comply meant confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. By the early 1500s, Lisbon had transformed into one of Europe's wealthiest cities, its docks overflowing with spice cargo. For a time, it seemed Portugal had rewritten the rules of global trade. This dominance had cultural effects too. Portuguese missionaries spread Christianity alongside spice contracts, intertwining religion with trade. Language, cuisine, and architecture in port cities still bear traces of this era, but the cost was high. The Indian Ocean became a militarized zone, where trade was no longer mutual exchange but violent enforcement. Then came the Dutch. In 1602, they created the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, a revolutionary entity that combined private capital, state backing, and military force. It became the world's first multinational corporation. The VOC didn't just trade spices, it waged wars, built forts, minted coins, and ruled over entire islands. To secure a monopoly on nutmeg, the VOC famously exterminated nearly the entire population of the Banda Islands. They forced farmers to grow only what the company demanded, and executed anyone who disobeyed. Amsterdam became the center of a new financial world, where people bought and sold shares based on the future price of pepper. The stock exchange was born. Modern capitalism found its roots here, not in factories, but in cloves and cinnamon. The Dutch obsession with order, records, and control turned spice trading into a machine, but it also left deep scars across Southeast Asia, where indigenous cultures were uprooted and replaced by plantation logic. The VOC's bureaucracy and merciless efficiency made it a model for future corporations. Shareholder profits came before human cost. Profit margins justified massacres. And this wasn't hidden. It was proudly documented in ledgers and logs, preserved in museums of trade and colonization. Not to be outdone, the British entered the fray. The British East India Company, founded in 1600, began with a focus on spices, but quickly expanded. They traded tea, silk, cotton, and eventually opium. Their influence in India grew rapidly. What started as trading posts became fortified settlements, then cities, then colonies. Battles with the Dutch and the French stretched from the coasts of India to the jungles of Borneo. Control over spices was just the beginning. Britain would go on to dominate South Asia entirely, using commercial interests to justify conquest. The East India Company was not just a business, it was a state within a state, with its own army and laws. Its impact rippled across centuries. The company's policies reshaped Indian agriculture, economy, and governance. Spices remained part of the trade, but the real prize became control. Control of territory, control of people, control of narratives. The legacy of the East India Company would live on long after its dissolution, influencing Britain's colonial machinery well into the 20th century. This model, conquest cloaked in commerce, would be repeated across Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And it all began with a craving for pepper. As global production increased and new regions began cultivating spices, their value declined. The Caribbean produced nutmeg, Madagascar grew cloves. The mystique faded as spices flooded European markets. Once stored under lock and key, they now sat on every kitchen shelf. But the consequences of the spice trade endured. Ruined civilizations, enriched empires, and a global economy fueled by colonialism and exploitation. The frenzy was over, but the world it built remained. Spices became ordinary, but the infrastructure built around them did not vanish. Port cities remained hubs of trade. Plantation systems evolved but stayed exploitative. The cultural exchanges, both violent and enriching, forever changed global diets, economies, and politics. The story didn't end. It simply changed flavor. Global cuisines are proof of this legacy. Indian curries, Moroccan tagines, Chinese five-spice blends, all echo centuries of conflict and connection. The dishes we eat today are silent testaments to voyages, conquests, and resistance.
The spice trade was never just about taste. It reshaped the world. It led to the discovery of new continents, the rise of capitalism, and centuries of imperial domination. It built cities, destroyed cultures, and laid the foundations of globalization. What began as a search for flavor became a conquest for power. The humble spices we grind onto our food today were once worth blood, gold, and war. The spice trade didn't just flavor history, it wrote it. Its echoes are still heard today, in the ports that thrive, the cuisines we savor, and the economic systems we inherit. From saffron rice in Morocco to masala chai in Mumbai, the spice trade left behind a world knit together by flavor and scarred by conquest. Its story is a reminder that something as small as a seed can alter the fate of nations. We still live in a world shaped by these trade routes. The same forces, desire, exploitation, globalization, continue in new forms. To understand the world we live in today, we must trace the taste that once changed everything.